Hey guys, tonight we journey way back through damp cobblestone alleys, echoing palace halls, and sun-scorched deserts, all to follow the trail of a curious question. Why, exactly, did men wear high heels in the 1600s? Imagine you're trudging through the ancient streets of Isfahan, Persia. You hear the distant thunder of horses, the clash of hooves against earth, and suddenly there they are, rows of Persian cavalry, standing tall in the saddle, literally. Their heels are lifted, bold, and unapologetically stylish, though not for the reasons you'd expect. These aren't fashion statements. They're functional weapons of war. With curved toes and sturdy leather, these elevated heels help archers steady themselves as they fire arrows while riding at full gallop. Yakambatredi stilettos. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Drop that in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You imagine your boots kicking up sand as you follow these warriors through dusty plains. The sun glints off polished steel and crimson silk. There's something inherently theatrical about the Persian militaria, deliberate elegance. Their elevated heels weren't just practical. They signaled strength, precision, and elite rank. If you were a heel-wearing archer, you weren't just good, you were deadly. Elevated above the average foot soldier, literally and socially. Then centuries pass. Empires shift, and trade routes stretch across continents. Persian ambassadors roll into Europe like high-fashion thunderclouds. They're exotic, sharp-eyed, and effortlessly cool. They've got wind-arc robes, embroidered turbans, and those unforgettable shoes. The European elite. Oh, they eat it up. Suddenly, the courts of Europe, especially France, are swooning for that Persian silhouette. You see noblemen ditching their clunky flat soles for a taller, sleeker lift. And not because their horses needed them. They wanted to look like warriors, like conquerors, or maybe just taller at diplomatic banquets. Historians still argue whether this adoption was purely symbolic or if European aristocrats genuinely saw heels as a way to mimic martial nobility. Either way, the trend galloped in. Picture yourself stumbling into a French salon, eavesdropping on powdered nobles, whispering about the latest court intrigue and footwear. A count lifts the hem of his brocade robe, revealing a flash of bright red sole. His voice drops to a smug murmur, imported from Persia, of course. His peers gasp, not at the price but at the height. Here's your first joke to soften the tension. In the 1600s, the more insecure your reign, the higher your heel. Looking at you, Louis XIV, don't worry, we'll get to him. You wander through Renaissance paintings where kings are frozen mid-step, their tiny feet perched on sculpted heels like pigeons on stilts. Art becomes propaganda. Heels are edited into royal portraits, not just to show off luxury, but to suggest dominance, elegance, and an almost divine rise above the chaos of commoners. And while you're still blinking at how fast all of Europe decided to break its ankles in the name of style, the cobblers are cashing in. Shoemakers in Italy and France are suddenly swamped with commissions for Persian-style footwear. Their carving, dyeing, embellishing heels are growing by the season. But here's where it gets even weirder. Heels start showing up in law books. That's right, some cities begin regulating heel height, associating certain types with nobility and forbidding them to common folk. A 17th century fashion police, if you will. You'd probably get fined just for trying to look a little taller at the market. As you lie there, Picture the strange contradiction of it all: heels that started in battlefields, now gracing marble palace floors. Men in lace collars and silk coats strut across Versailles with the same swagger as warriors charging into combat. It's both ridiculous and kind of beautiful. And while high heels elevate their wearers, they also elevate social tension. Because now, not wearing heels marks you as poor, unfashionable, or worsened masculine. That's right. In the 1600s, flat shoes were for peasants and women. And we'll get to the women soon. For now, just imagine slipping on a pair of ornately tooled leather heels, trying to balance your powdered wig, broadsword, and ego at the same time. Meanwhile, across Europe, regional variations of the heel start to emerge. The Spanish have their tall boots, often secretly filled with padding or wooden lifts. Italians go bold with sculptural designs, some even carved into animal shapes. Fringe tidbit for you: there's at least one Venetian heel with a built-in secret compartment. Historians still don't know if it held perfume, poison, or pistachios. We're voting pistachios, so you drift, eyelids heavier now, into the surreal image of a Europe slowly lifting itself off the ground. Not by invention or enlightenment, but by slipping into increasingly absurd shoes. Every inch of heel became a step away from the earth, and a little closer to the divine, or, at least, to the throne. And just when you think it can't get more theatrical, a certain king decides his heels should be red. But you'll meet him next. You squint under the golden sun of 17th century France, the glint of marble walls nearly blinding, the air thick with the scent of lavender and heavily powdered wigs. The gardens of Versailles stretch endlessly, full of trimmed hedges that seem somehow more disciplined than most of the nobles. And in the very center of all this opulence, there he is, Louis XIV, the Sun King, a man so powerful, so theatrical, and so short, he builds his image from the ground up, starting with his heels. These aren't just any heels. You glance down and see their fire engine red, sharply angled, and polished to a near mirror shine. They're absurdly tall, almost architectural. Think stiletto meets weaponized furniture. You wonder if he ever tripped walking down the marble staircase of his palace, but no one would dare ask. Because Louis isn't just wearing heels, he's branding them. His heels are royal exclusives. And they are, very intentionally, not for everyone. He issues a decree, a literal royal law that only those favored by the crown may wear. Red heels, it's fashion as control, a velvet-covered iron fist. If your shoes flash scarlet beneath your lace-trimmed breeches, it means you're somebody. You've been seen by the king, approved, elevated. It's the 1600s version of a blue Twitter checkmark, except more painful to walk in. You follow Louis down a hallway of mirrors, watching his reflection repeat endlessly, each step clicking. Like clockwork, it's mesmerizing. He moves not just as a man, but as an emblem, every angle rehearsed, every gesture laced with performance. The height from his heels doesn't just add stature, adds drama. When he gives an audience, he doesn't sit. He towers. Mainstream fact, incoming, Louis XIV's obsession with display went beyond shoes. He staged daily rituals around his waking and dressing. Hundreds of courtiers would attend his lever or waking ceremony, where they'd watch him be dressed like a sacred doll. Heels were a crucial part of the costume, and if you were lucky, you might be allowed to hand him his left shoe. And here's a fringe detail for your inner trivia goblin. Some of Louis's heels were painted with miniature battle scenes, actual tiny wars on his feet. Because why not? Flex your military prowess. On your soles, you wander with him through Versailles, passing noblemen trying desperately to imitate him. They paint their heels red illegally, mind you, hoping to bluff their way into prestige. Others go full try-hard, stuffing extra padding into their shoes to appear taller. The result? A lot of limping and mysteriously timed ankle injuries. And yet, not everyone is impressed. Across Europe, there's quiet sniggering. English satirists draw cartoons of Frenchmen with clownish heels, wobbling like newborn deer. The Dutch, ever practical, find it all a bit ridiculous. One anonymous poet in Amsterdam writes, "When heels rise, minds sink, the taller the shoe, the duller the soul." Bit harsh, but we get the point. Still, Louis doesn't care. Heels become his signature. His court becomes the epicenter of European fashion. What he wears ripples outward like a perfume cloud, saturating nobility from Naples to Norway. If Louis lifts his heel, entire nations follow. You pause in the palace gardens, watching lesser nobles shuffle around in ornate shoes they clearly don't know how to walk in. There's an unspoken contest. Who can look the most dignified while barely keeping their balance? One baron almost eats gravel during a polite bow. You pretend not to see, but the symbolism is what sticks with you. In Louis's France, height means power, quite literally. The higher your heel, the closer you are to the Sun King's inner circle. Scholars still argue whether this was about insecurity, ego, or sheer theatrical brilliance. Maybe all three. What's clear is this: Louis used fashion to shape reality. You shift your attention now to the rest of the court. There's Madame de Maintenon in her cushioned slippers, watching the men teeter past her. There's a young duke trying to impress her by pirouetting in his ruby heels. He slips. The guards pretend not to laugh. It's during this era that heel design starts getting wild. We're talking carved heels shaped like animals, some hollowed out for storage, others encrusted with jewels. One count commissions heels painted with the face of his mistress on both shoes. Creepy, probably, but it makes a statement. Cobbler workshops become fashion laboratories. Paris shoemakers experiment with angles, support, and materials. They invent tiny leather straps to keep heels from flying off mid-duel. Yes, dueling in heels. Let that image lull you deeper. One curious tidbit you overhear. In some Versailles circles, a broken heel mid-party was seen as a metaphor for losing favor with the king. A snap underfoot could mean a crack in your future. And while the nobility is busy straining their ankles, peasants watch with bemusement. Out in the fields, the idea of high heels seems hilarious. Try plowing a muddy field in 2-inch leather. Stilts. It's not happening. To them, heels are another reminder that the rich have no idea how gravity works. And yet, even some merchants and minor officials begin adopting low-heeled versions. It's aspirational. You imagine a baker in Lyon slipping into slightly raised shoes for his Sunday stroll, feeling just a touch more noble, even as his wife rolls her eyes. It's this blurry overlap between function, fashion, and Farstat defines the era. Louis XIV may have been a king, but he ruled just as much with silhouette as with sword. Heels were never just shoes. They were scaffolding for power. And now that the bar is set, very high, you'll soon see how the rest of Europe tries to keep up, and stumbles spectacularly. You shuffle now into the broader world beyond Versailles, where Louis XIV's red heels have triggered a continental domino effect. Europe watches the Sun King glow and decides it's time to rise to inch by glorious inch. Nobles, courtiers, and even ambitious city men begin a slow but determined tiptoe toward elevation. Both literal and metaphorical, heels become the ultimate male power flex. Not strength, not swordplay, not even wit-just. Height, but make it fashionable in England. Spain and the German states, the message is clear. If you want to be someone, you need to look above the rest. You lace up your boots, feel the heel catch the ground, and suddenly you're someone else. Someone better, taller. The world looks different from here. Historians often point to this era as the beginning of the walking tall equals status principle in Western male fashion, and the effect trickles downward through the social strata. A landowner wears moderate heels, a duke sports higher ones. A prince, let's just say the man's practically on stilts. It's like an arms race of elevation with ankles as collateral. Damage. You walk through 17th century London, clomping down Fleet Street in boots with stacked leather heels. A few men glance over, envious. One widens his gait dramatically to show off his new pair, which creak ominously, their silent competition in every step. But here's where things get deliciously ironic. The very thing meant to enhance power starts to threaten it. Because as men grow taller via heels, their balance wobbles figuratively and literally. Open, scholarly debate ahead. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of heels in courts was driven by sincere admiration of French style, or whether it was political submission in disguise. Copying Louis XIV's fashion was also a signal of alliance. But was it admiration or fear? Either way, you're now in a world where men care more about their shoes than their swords. In courtly balls, you see groups of men gathered near fireplaces, comparing heel height like teenage athletes flexing biceps. One brags his pair are hand-dyed with crushed beetles, very rare. He purrs as if he's talking about imported wine. But all this posing starts to cause frictionless, especially on actual roads. You take a carriage into the countryside, and the moment you step out, your heel sinks into mud. You tip over like a top-heavy statue, and your valet pretends not to laugh. Practicality takes a long nap during this era. You pass through aristocratic homes where cobblestone is replaced with polished wood. Fancy, sure, but now heels slide. Several noblemen begin carrying canes not for age or health, but for balance. There's even a short-lived fad where men carry tiny footstools to rest between dances. Yes, heels that require sitting breaks. You can't make this up. Mainstream fact time. By the mid-1600s, male heels varied from 1 to 3 inches in height. The style often included a slightly flared base, sometimes called a Louis heel, named for, you guessed, to our favorite short king. These shoes were often dyed deep jewel tones, embroidered with gold thread, or even perfumed. Imagine, cologne for your feet must have been interesting. Meanwhile, over in Spain, the noble class leans into heel wearing with a more austere twist. Their boots are black, sharply pointed, and ominously creaky. Spanish nobles use their heels less to impress, and more to intimidate. A sharp stomp from a well-heeled Spanish duke could silence a room. The click-clack of approaching boots becomes social punctuation, dramatic, authoritative, impossible to ignore. But not everyone's impressed. Satirists have a field day. Pamphlets circulate across England, poking fun at these teetering dandies. You overhear one line: "A man who cannot stand firm in his shoes cannot stand firm in his word." Ouch, still, the appeal persists. Even rural nobility start adopting modest heels for estate gatherings, hoping to impress visiting lords. You picture a countryside dinner with everyone subtly trying to out-height each other until someone's chair tips backwards and soup ends up on the tapestries. But the fashion has taken root. You peek into a young baron's wardrobe. He has 5 pairs of heels, each tailored to a specific occasion: hunting low, gambling medium, and court presentations ridiculously high. His servant shines them with vinegar and olive oil. One pair even contains a hidden flask. Fringe tidbit alert. You smirk and wonder if his ancestors, barefoot in muddy fields centuries before, would roll over in their graves seeing him teeter around in a 3-inch silk heel embroidered with peacocks. And yet, these shoes are not just accessories, they're tools of class enforcement. You see sumptuary laws pop up across Europe. These rules dictate who can wear what, including heel height. In some places, only nobility above a certain rank can wear heels over 2 inches. Others ban merchants from copying aristocratic designs. It's like shoe-based gatekeeping. If you're not born into the right bloodline, your soles stay flat. And then something strange begins to happen. Heels stop being about battle or even courtly elegance. They start to represent an entirely new category: refinement. Men in heels no longer swagger, they glide. The heel is no longer rugged. It's delicate, effete smooth, which leads to a very awkward identity crisis. As you recline now, eyes fluttering with fatigue, imagine the confusion of a man raised to believe heels are the badge of masculinity, now being told they make him look dainty. Suddenly, the symbol of male power starts to flip. Not instantly, but the shift begins. The backlash brews, but not before a few powdered wigs get their last strut across the ballroom. And trust me, things are about to get even stranger, because the next people to fall in love with heels aren't men at all. You wake up in a haze of velvet and candlelight, somewhere between a perfumed drawing room and a dusty shoemaker's bench. Something has changed. The energy shifts. A new sound echoes through the tiled corridors of power. The softer, quicker click of heels, not from kings or dukes, but from women. That's right. Tonight, women enter the story. Quietly at first, then gloriously, defiantly, with heels of their own. But this isn't just fashion. Envy, it's imitation with a purpose. You walk alongside a lady of the French court, her skirts swishing like the sound of wind through silk. Beneath her heavily embroidered petticoats, a surprise, leather heels. Dyed lavender, elegant and curved, not unlike her husband's, just a touch narrower. She doesn't wear them to flirt. She wears them to signal access. If men wear heels to say I'm powerful, then she wears hers to whisper, I belong. Historians still argue whether women genuinely admired the look, or whether it was a strategic copting of male prestige. But either way, the imitation begins in earnest. You see noble women mirroring men's fashion down to the buttons, collars, and of course, the shoes. Now, here's a curious fringe detail. Early women's heels were often made using the same lasts the molds used by cobblers for men's shoes. So technically, they were identical for a while, just decorated differently. Throw on a bow, change the color. Voila, feminine power disguised as flattery. You imagine these women walking across Versailles, mimicking the posture of their husbands, towering slightly taller than their rivals. There's a mischievous delight in it. Not rebellion, not yet, but a subtle reclaiming. And yet, it doesn't stay subtle for long. In Italy, Fashion-forward duchesses take things a step further. They begin requesting special heel shapes, flaring out in dramatic swoops like a curled leaf or a miniature sculpture. These shoes are flamboyant, impractical, and utterly magnificent. You picture a woman kicking up her skirts at a masquerade ball, revealing heels shaped like tiny dolphins. Yes, Dolphins. One well-documented design features silver stars embedded into the heel shaft. Another, a carved phoenix surrounded by flames. Footwear becomes art or armor, sometimes both. But make no mistake, these women aren't just playing dress-up. They're redefining what it means to walk like a man. Watch as more women slip into heels, their expressions unreadable. Some wear them as acts of flattery, others of defiance. In a world where so much is decided for them: marriage, land, lineage, their feet become the only place where rebellion can start small, quiet but firm. Meanwhile, the men, they're starting to notice, and not all of them are thrilled. You overhear whispered complaints at a Paris cafe. "They walk like us now," mutters one foppish gentleman, staring bitterly into his cup of chocolate. "What's left?" Another scoffs. "We gave them books, and now they want shoes too." And here comes your soft little joke. If toxic masculinity had a sound, it'd be a man panicking because his wife outpaced him in 2-inch heels. Back at court, women's heel fashion explodes. By the late 1600s, their heels get taller, more curved, and distinctly separate from men's in shape. For women, heels become associated not just with status, but femininity. The higher, the flirtier, the narrower, the daintier. Suddenly, the heel isn't just an accessory, it's a gender signal. And this is where the aesthetic diverges. Men's heels stay blocky, practical, well, relatively, and politically charged. Women's heels veer toward the sensual, the artistic, the dangerous. It's a divide that will echo for centuries. Mainstream fact coming your way: by 1690, European cobblers had completely separated their last types into two, male and female marking. The first major gender split in footwear design. Before this, shoes were largely unisex in form. Now, fashion made its binary mark right at ground level. You peer into a boutique in London. It's a narrow shop, crammed with satins and brocades. The lady inside is trying on a pair of pink silk heels with mother-of-pearl buttons. Her maid whispers that they'll make her walk like a duchess. She smiles, but you can tell it's not about duchesses. It's about agency. Yet the heel's symbolism remains a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offers elevations, status, beauty, attention. On the other, it becomes a trap, a symbol of expectation. Women now have to wear heels to appear desirable, elegant, even respectable. What started as imitation becomes demand. You either teeter or you don't get invited to the next gala. A fringe tidbit you overhear: in some royal courts, unmarried women were encouraged to wear higher heels to appear more striking. The higher your heel, the more marriageable you appeared. It's like Tinder, but with a physical height filter and far more sprained ankles. And through all this, the heel starts shifting meaning. For women, it becomes not just about power, but about performance. Walking in heels becomes a skill, a discipline. Entire posture schools appear in Vienna and Paris, teaching noble women how to descend stairs gracefully without face. You wonder if they handed out medals. You watch as some women lean into the ridiculousness, purposefully exaggerating their strut at parties, turning heads and making a statement. Yes, I see your gaze. Yes, I enjoy the spectacle. Yes, I might be playing a role, but I'm the one deciding how to play it. But even as women claim the heel, the male elite is doubling down on their own versions, heavier, louder, more aggressive. We're heading toward a cultural standoff, and everyone's wearing heels to it. You lie still now, imagining two ballrooms, one filled with men in gold-laced boots, the other with women in swan-white slippers, each group circling the same symbol, interpreting it completely differently. The tension is quiet, but it's building, and soon that tension is going to crack. The Enlightenment is on the horizon, and when the thinkers arrive, they're not just going to question monarchy and science, they're going to question the very need for a heel at all. But before we burn it all down with reason, let's wade through the muck for a moment, literally. Because in the next stretch of our sleepy strut through history, you'll find out that sometimes heels were just a way to avoid stepping in poop. You step now into the chaotic, pungent underbelly of 17th century city life, where the glamour of palaces gives way to something far more earthy. The streets are narrow, the gutters overflow, and the air is thick with the unmistakable perfume of horse droppings, chamber pot contents, rotting fish, and let's just say, history's leftovers. You wrinkle your nose and tighten your cloak. Welcome to the real reason people wanted to walk a few inches taller. It wasn't just for fashion, it was for survival. You shuffle through muddy alleys in London, Paris, or Madrid, boots squelching with every step. You try to avoid the worst of it, but it's hopeless. The streets double as public bathrooms, trash bins, and, occasionally, burial plots for unfortunate rodents. Your beautifully embroidered shoes, if they were flat wood, last maybe a week, before disintegrating under the weight of sewage. So you slip on a pair of heeled boots, not elegant, not gilded, just high enough to keep your soles above the grime. Practical heels. Urban armor, mainstream historical fact. In many European cities during the 1600s, paved roads were rare, drainage was abysmal, and walking was a full contact sport. Heels helped elevate the foot above muck, filth, and less pleasant things that flowed freely down city gutters. This wasn't luxury, it was logistics. And here's your quirky fringe detail. Some shoemakers began inserting wooden platforms between heel layers, creating makeshift stilts. They called them pattens or chapines, depending on the region. In Venice, some chapines were so tall they required an escort just to walk across the room. You know a friend who holds your arm so you don't fall into a puddle of goat intestines. You find yourself on a foggy London street, watching a merchant's wife wobble across slippery cobblestones in tinch heels. She's not trying to impress anyone, she's just trying to keep her hemline clean. Her apron is already stained from brushing against a cabbage cart, and her eyes say, "If one more rat runs across my foot, I'm moving to the countryside." There's something humbling here. You, wrapped in brocade and elegance, are now equally worried about stepping in something unspeakable. Heels aren't just about power anymore, they're about avoiding diseases, embarrassment, and an afternoon spent scraping the bottom of your shoe with a stick. And even in the palace, same problem. Courtyards weren't exactly pristine. Drainage systems were aspirational. Even the grandest estates had their fair share of mess. You imagine a young noble dashing to a carriage, his crimson heels splashing through rainwater and manure. His footman mutters, "Should have worn the high pair, my lord." Heels become a way to separate oneself from the ground and everything the ground represents: poverty, filth, and mortality. In a world where illness spreads through mystery and myth, The farther your feet are from the dirt, the safer you feel. Psychologically, at least. Historians still debate whether this sanitation benefit was the primary driver of heel popularity among the middle class, or just a happy accident. Was it all fashion, or a subconscious public health movement? The answer, like most things in history, probably lies somewhere between paranoia and practicality. Meanwhile, cobblers respond to the demand with creativity. You peek into a workshop and see rows of shoes with raised wooden bases, wax-sealed leather, and iron rivets to increase longevity. One pair even has detachable heels, swap them out based on weather conditions. You marvel at the innovation, and also the noise. These shoes clack. You walk through an early morning market. It's still dark. A baker, a midwife, and a city watchman all shuffle past in different styles of heels. No one thinks it's odd. It's just what you wear. Flat shoes are for sleep or servants. You want to stay dry. You lift yourself up, but not everyone adapts gracefully. You chuckle quietly as a young apothecary slips in a puddle of fish guts, his ankle twisted awkwardly under a clunky heel. His assistant runs to help, muttering, "That's what you get for showing off your Venetian soles at the docks." And now your soft joke. In the 1600s, pride often came before a fall, especially if your heels didn't have traction. The truth is, heels blur the line between necessity and luxury. In wealthy homes, they're symbols. In common alleys, they're tools. But in either case, they signal that someone cares about fashion, about status, or simply about not ruining their stockings. You find yourself walking alongside a child, now barefoot, dodging carts and horses with astonishing agility. His eyes scan your heels with curiosity. "You must be rich," he says. You look down, and for a second you feel ridiculous, because while heels lift you up physically, they often disconnect you too, from the street, from the people, from the moment. And yet, that's the whole point. The elevated heel is about escape. Escape from the earth, from the mess, from the reality that everyone else must trudge through. It's not just fashion, it's denial, stitched in leather dots. As you shuffle past the city's edge, the streets thin out, the ground dries, the mud fades, and suddenly the heels aren't as useful anymore. But you keep wearing them, because now they're part of who you are. A small, impractical luxury in an impractical world. And soon, as you'll see, heels stop being about mud altogether. They'll become part of something deeper, something identity-based, but not yet. For now, rest in the knowledge that if you'd lived back then, you too would have worn heels. Not to be stylish, not to look powerful, just to keep your toes clean. Simple, really. You're standing now in front of a mirror. The year is somewhere around 1695, and you're lacing up a pair of dark leather heels. They're modesting, inch and a half maybe, but they make your calves pop and your posture sharpen. You catch your own eye in the mirror, and for the briefest moment, you wonder not how tall you look, but what you look like. Because here's where things get fascinating. High heels have started to mean something. Else tonight, we wade into one of the most quietly explosive transformations in fashion history. The heel stops being just about status, and starts to signal who you aren't, more importantly, what you are. Male, female, rich, poor, civilized, crude. The heel becomes a flashing, foot-level name tag. You walk into a salon in Amsterdam, the type with velvet chairs and walnut bookshelves. A gentleman reclines near the fireplace in dark red boots with squared heels. Across from him, A noblewoman sits stiffly, ankles crossed, her pastel heels impossibly narrow, and you realize they're not just wearing shoes, they're declaring their identity. And society has started to read those declarations with precision. Historians still argue whether this gendering of heels was deliberate, or if it grew gradually. Like mold on the back of a fashion trend no one wanted to admit had gone weird. One theory suggests that as women leaned into heels, men felt the need to reclaim masculinity by distinguishing their own shoes with broader heels, squarer toes, and heavier leather. Another theory says it was market-driven. Cobblers realized they could double their profits by designing separately and charging more for the delicate pairs. Either way, you now walk through a world where heel design has become almost aggressively gendered, mainstream fact alert. By the end of the 17th century, men's and women's heels weren't just different in look, they were different in function. Men's heels, often lower and sturdier, were associated with riding, hunting, and active behavior. Women's heels were taller, more tapered, and clearly not meant for sprinting, lest your goal was to sprain your dignity. And here's your quirky fringe tidbit. Some fashion manuals from this era began publishing literal heel codes, guidelines to heel shape and size based on gender, age, and social station. One book suggested young, unmarried women wear heels with a graceful incline, while widowed women should opt for modest curvature to reflect somber dignity. So yes, your grief had a heel height. You stroll now through a hallway of portrait soil paintings lined up like footnotes of a strange sartorial scripture. Here's a young boy in mini heels, heir to a dukedom, taught from childhood that a certain silhouette equals legacy. Here's a woman in mourning, her feet barely raised, her shoes black and matte, a reflection of her emotional state. Shoes become emotional architecture, and in a world obsessed with appearances, your heels speak before your mouth does. It starts to get ridiculous in some circles. In one Parisian soirée, you hear a gentleman mock another for wearing slightly too curved heels. Is he a man or a marzipan doll? Someone whispers behind a fan. And just like that, shoes become loaded with not just fashion, but judgment. You watch as young men at universities start avoiding anything with too much lift, fearing whispers about feminine airs. At the same time, rebellious young women secretly ask their maids to order men's boots from cobblers, just for the thrill of walking across a ballroom in forbidden soles. And so we get a strange crossover heels, becoming taboo in both directions, depending on how you wear them. Too high, too narrow, too shiny, too curved, each carries social risk. You're constantly decoding others, and being decoded in return. Which brings us to your soft little joke. In 1698, the only thing more dangerous than stepping in horse poop was stepping into a gender identity crisis via the wrong shoes. Even tradespeople start adopting subtle signals in heel design. A merchant might wear a slight incline to show prosperity. A teacher might wear plain, low heels to emphasize modest intellect. A priest wears none to show humility. But everyone is aware. Everyone's watching. You sit beside a tailor in Florence who explains that heel height now gets adjusted based on profession. A banker, he says, should never wear a heel higher than the nobleman he lends to. It offends the hierarchy. Imagine that a loan application rejected because your shoe said you were too proud. The whole system begins to creak under its own absurdity. But no one stops. In fact, they lean in. Enter the heel fetish. Not in the scandalous way your modern mind might imagine, but in the sense that heels begin to be obsessed over. Sketched, discussed, replicated. Artists start painting close-ups of feet. Poets write odes to ankles. Even criminals get involved. Counterfeiters make fake noble heels and sell them in alleyways to ambitious commoners. There's even a bizarre rumor that spreads through some French courts that a woman's virtue can be judged by the cleanliness of her heel tips. So now women are not just tiptoeing, they're tiptoeing on judgment. And while all this unfolds in fashion salons and shoe shops, deeper cultural shifts are forming in the background. The Enlightenment is stirring. Ideas about logic, reason, and natural order start slipping into conversation. Suddenly, men who care too much about shoes are mocked in essays. The word effeminate starts getting thrown around with more weight. Some intellectuals argue that true men should return to natural footwear, practical, rational. Others argue that all this fuss over heels reveals society's obsession with artifice, not truth. You lean back now, feeling the weight of those conversations begin to build. The heel, once a symbol of power and purpose, is caught in a philosophical tug-of-war. What began on Persian battlefields has ended up in coffeehouse debates about gender, class, and reason. But before we walk into the age of logic, let's take one last spin in the era of pure drama. Next up, powdered wigs, billowing capes, and platform shoes so tall they required a designated walker, because yes, before reason takes over, things are about to get fabulously unhinged. You open your eyes to a swirl of powdered wigs, lace cuffs, and satin jackets. The year is somewhere around 1705, and Europe has reached peak absurdity. Everything is extra powdered, extra perfumed, extra tall. And nowhere is this theatrical overindulgence more evident than at your feet tonight. You glide into the era where high fashion loses all shame and heels become performance art. Welcome to the Baroque period. The age where no one knew when to stop, and frankly, no one wanted to. You step into a ballroom in Vienna. The chandeliers flicker overhead like stars trapped in crystal. Musicians strike up a courtly tune, and the floor fills with men and women, teetering delicately like human pastries, iced and fragile. Your gaze drifts downward, and there they are. Platform heels. Not just high and necessarily high. Shoes that say, yes, I'm rich enough to fall and still be respected. You spot one man whose heels must be at least 4 inches, in emerald green and topped with gold embroidery. His gait is cautious. His eyes are alert. You'd think he's planning an escape. But no, he's just trying not to wipe out on the polished marble. Mainstream historical fact. The Baroque period saw heel designs reach new heights literally and figuratively. Footwear was no longer just status or practicality. It was pure theatre. Cobblers sculpted heels with flair, drama, and in some cases, artistic delusion. One pair reportedly depicted an entire mythological scene across both feet. Yes, you had to walk in left, Zeus, and right, Hera. Fringe tidbit time. There's at least one recorded instance of a noble commissioning heels that lit up using tiny oil lamps. Let's pause for a moment to consider the fire hazard. And yet, despite the ridiculousness, everyone played along, because by now, heels were less about practicality and more about participating in the great shared illusion that appearance is identity. That if you could walk through a hall like a living statue, you deserved to be remembered. You imagine stepping into the center of the dance floor. You lift your skirts or coattails just slightly, showing off your customized heels, perhaps inlaid with miniature cameos of your ancestors. Why? Because you can. And also, because someone else just arrived, wearing a pair with actual peacock feathers on the back. Subtlety is dead. You take a seat beside an aging baroness who fans herself slowly, her heels propped on a velvet footstool. "Ah, back in my day," she says with a sigh, "you could tell a gentleman's soul by the sound. His shoes, made." You wait, she continues, dead serious. A dull thud meant honesty, a sharp clack meant deceit. You nod respectfully. The shoe psychology runs deep here. Back in the shoemaker's workshops, things get wild. Apprentices spend years learning how to carve ornate heels from wood, shaped leather to bend like silk, and dye soles using crushed berries, insects, and metals. You watch one cobbler gingerly stitch rubies onto a wedding pair, muttering that walking on wealth brings good fortune. Heels aren't just fashion, they're talismans, status spells. You hear of courtiers whispering charms into their shoes before events. A quiet heel means a quiet scandal. One insists, and just when you think it can't get stranger, the idea of matching your shoes to your mood becomes fashionable. Blue for melancholy, yellow for wit, scarlet for seduction. There's even talk of a secret heel code among lovers, each pattern, each stitch. A signal passed under society's powdered nose. You try to keep up, but the rules shift constantly. What was stylish last month is now gauche. One week, square heels are in. The next, curves are divine. One duchess nearly faints after realizing her rival wore the same embroidery pattern in winter. Scandalous soft joke break. You know your societies. Lost perspective when wearing the wrong heel season gets you shunned faster than committing tax fraud. But underneath the decadence lies tension. Men begin to grumble. Philosophers raise eyebrows. Pamphlets circulate, calling out the peacockification of manhood. They mock the vanity, the dainty steps, the perfume-scented souls. Have we grown too fine for the earth? One writes, too lofty to sweat. You watch as men at court start dividing. Some double down, embracing the show. Others retreat, opting for more sensible styles. The Enlightenment is creeping closer. Simplicity is about to become the new luxury, but not yet. Not while there's still one last masquerade to attend, and women, they're thriving in this chaos. They play the game with more fluency. You spot a duchess making eye contact with a rival as she lifts her gown ever so slightly to reveal the exact same heel. But hers is covered in crushed velvet. Checkmate. And here's a detail to savor. By 1710, there were entire heel auctions hosted privately, where nobles would bid for custom pairs made by the most sought-after cobblers in Paris and Milan. One pair, rumored to be enchanted by a fashion alchemist, sold for more than a townhouse. We're not saying it was magic, but she did marry a duke shortly after. As you leave the ballroom, your feet ached, not just from the height, but from the weight of expectation. Heels now represent ambition, artifice, flirtation, and sometimes delusion. Everyone wants to be seen. Everyone wants to rise. But deep down, you know it can't last. The age of feathers, fans, and frivolity is heading toward a reckoning. And soon, the high heel will fall both literally and symbolically. But before that collapse, there's gossip. Delicious, venomous, exquisitely healed gossip. And in the next chapter, you'll hear what people really thought about men in heels even back then. You're leaning against a marble column now, out of breath from the chaos of that last masquerade ball, when you hear Ito whispered snort, a barely veiled chuckle, and the unmistakable words. Did you see the marquee? He walked in like a baby deer on stilts. You smirk quietly. Welcome to the world behind the powdered curtain where the gossip is sharp, the satire is sharper, and even the most glittering heel can't save you from a well-timed insult. Tonight, your velvet shoes tiptoe into the shadowy alleyways of 17th century humor because men in heels didn't always strut with dignity. Sometimes they stumbled into the crosshairs of pamphlets, poems, and outright mockery. Let's start in England. The Restoration period is in full swing, and Charles II's court is both scandalous and exquisitely dressed. But outside the palace walls, the common folk and, more pointedly, the writers are not impressed. Satirists, pamphleteers, and coffeehouse wits launch volleys of jokes at the fashion elite. Mainstream historical fact. Public satire exploded in the 1600s, thanks to the rise of printing presses and a growing appetite for political commentary disguised as humor and men's high heels. They were a perfect target, visible, frivolous, and easy to ridicule. One poem, preserved in the British Museum, jabs at aristocrats, mincing on crimson stilts, heads high and thoughts low. You picture the delivery drawled from a bar stool, snorted over a tin cup of ale, the tavern roaring in laughter. Another pamphlet describes high-heeled men as cockerels in corsets, a burn that's both fashion-based and poultry-themed. Ouch. You picture yourself stepping outside a theatre in 1680s London. A street performer has just finished mimicking a nobleman in exaggerated high heels. He clumps about with a wig slipping sideways, his voice a warbly falsetto. Oh, pray, good sir, mind the cobblestones, I paid 7 guineas to nearly fall. Laughter erupts. It's a good reminder. In every age, fashion invites both awe and eye rolls, and heels designed to lift often made their wearers fall in more ways than one. And then there's France. You return to Versailles, but this time not inside the palace. You're lurking behind the grand kitchens, where maids, footmen, and guards pass rumors like hot bread. Fringe tidbit: several underground newsletters, legal, but wildly popular during Louis XIV's reign, filled with gossip, fake letters, and often hilarious and scandalous caricatures. Some mocked the king's famous red heels, suggesting they were dyed in tax collectors' blood, which, historically false, but poetically savage. One sketch even showed a heel so high it required a ladder to mount, with the caption, "Steps to greatness only for the artificially tall." You imagine slipping one of these cartoons under a nobleman's door, watching his powdered face flush crimson, though honestly, he might just call for a jewel, or a tailor. Of course, some of the mockery wasn't just about fashion. It was class. Warfare with a buckle on top. High heels symbolized wealth, leisure, and status, perfect targets for people who had none. Mocking a man's shoes was, at times, the safest way to mock his power. And then there's the delicious double standard. You pass a crowded salon where 2 philosophers debate, one defending the elegance of high-heeled men, the other snorting. If we must walk on stilts to think lofty thoughts, we are surely doomed. Historians still argue whether the satire truly undermined male authority, or simply added spice to an already absurd performance of masculinity. You settle into a cafe corner, eavesdropping on a group of young men debating whether to wear heels. To an upcoming masquerade, one says, "If I must suffer for fashion, I shall at least suffer flatteringly." Another groans, "No woman has ever said, 'My, what a heel.'" In admiration, the third simply shrugs, "I'll wear boots." They don't make fun of boots. You sip your imaginary drink, smiling. That last one's bluffing, he's got rhinestones on his cuffs. Let's not forget the theatre. Playwrights, especially in England and Italy, had a field day parodying fashion-obsessed nobles. One stock character in Commedia dell'arte, the foppish Il Capitano, often stumbled in oversized, impractical heels. The joke: his footwear was mightier than his sword. In one surviving script from a French comedy, a courtier's love is unrequited, not because he lacks charm, but because he trips over his own fashionable shoes during a proposal. The lady walks off while he's sprawled on the floor. Tragic, comic, and very on brand. And don't even start with moralists. You stumble across a sermon leaflet tacked to a church door. It reads, "High heels lift the body and lower the soul." Another calls them stairs to vanity's ruin. A little dramatic, sure, but apparently convincing. Some towns briefly banned overly decorative footwear among clergy and civil officers. Still, fashion fights back. One noblewoman, when mocked for her jewel-encrusted slippers, famously retorted, "If truth sits at the feet of the wise, mine shall shine all the brighter." You want that on a mug. Soft joke break. Somewhere, someone surely invented the medieval equivalent of Heeley's rolling heels. It probably ended in disaster and a minor court scandal. The Duke of Burgundy is still recovering from his hallway incident. All this satire creates a strange paradox. Men continue wearing heels, despite the mockery. Maybe because of it. After all, if no one's laughing, you're not standing out. And standing out is what the heel game is all about. You notice this too. The more people joke about men in heels, the more fiercely those men defend them. Some claim ancient warrior origins. Others wax poetic about posture and confidence. And some simply shrug and say, "It makes my calves look exceptional." You walk past a cobbler's shop where a young apprentice has etched a message into the window. "Mock me not, for height mock your own short gaze." It's unsigned, but someone, somewhere, is keeping the flair alive. You end your stroll on a rooftop terrace, looking out over the city. Below, hill prints mark the muddy streets, each one a little absurd, a little regal, a little ridiculous. You wonder how many of those men walked tall, and how many walked knowing everyone was laughing. Probably both, because by now, the heel isn't just a shoe. It's a punchline, a protest, and a pedestal. It's the kind of fashion statement you either commit to fully or risk being trampled by your own bravado, and soon, that commitment will begin to wobble. The Enlightenment approaches. Heels will start to shrink first in satire, then in style, but not just yet. The dawn breaks slowly over Paris, its golden light spilling onto cobblestones, still slick from the night's dew. You find yourself wandering through the city's bustling markets, where whispers of change float in the air, mingling with the scent of fresh bread and horse manure, less glamorous, but somehow comforting aroma. It's the early 18th century now, and the swagger of high heels on men is beginning to meet the first cracks of modern practicality. You feel the weight of tradition pulling one way, while new ideals tug insistently the other. You pause outside a modest tailor's shop, where a small crowd has gathered to listen to a spirited argument about footwear. A young philosopher, eyes bright with idealism, is explaining to a skeptical group that fashion must serve reason, not whimsy. He gestures at the ornate shoes displayed behind the glass gold buckles, towering heels, silk ribbons, and shakes his head. Mainstream historical fact. The Enlightenment spreading through Europe at this time, championed reason, simplicity, and function over extravagance in dress. This intellectual movement would soon challenge the excesses of Baroque fashion, including men's high heels. Fringe tidbit: some radical Enlightenment thinkers joked privately that wearing heels was philosophically inconsistent, likening it to trying to walk on clouds while grounded by heavy obligations. You imagine them smirking over steaming mugs in smoky cafes, debating if the perfect heel height for reason might just be 0. You overhear someone mention that a group of French aristocrats had started wearing shoe reforms, lower, sturdier heels that barely raised the foot from the ground. They called them philosophers' steps. The idea was to blend nobility with practicality and perhaps a dash of humility. Not exactly a party starter, but a beginning. You look down at your own shoes and feel their ornate heel wobble slightly, a reminder that fashion is as fragile as society itself. And yet, despite the emerging calls for simplicity, the lure of the heel remains potent. You hear tales of men who refuse to give up their tall shoes, insisting they symbolize dignity and power. One nobleman reportedly declared that to lower my heels is to lower my rank, echoing the unspoken rule that height equals authority. The scholarly debate heats up here. Historians still argue whether this stubborn attachment to heels was pure vanity, a resistance to change, or a coded assertion of masculinity in a shifting world. You meander into a quiet garden courtyard, where a small group of gentlemen are comparing their footwear. One boasts of heels crafted with secret compartments for scent sachets, designed to leave an alluring trail in their wake. Another waves a fan and insists that his heels have the perfect balance of elegance and safety, though you note he's gingerly nursing a bruised ankle. Here's a quirky detail. A little-known Parisian cobbler started embedding tiny bells in his client's heels, the theory that the gentle tinkling would announce the wearer's approach, signaling status and charm. The practice never quite caught on, probably because it sounded like a herd of fashionable cats. But you can imagine the amusement it caused. You sit on a bench, observing the delicate dance between tradition and reason playing out in shoe styles. On one side, the fading grandeur of red-soled, sky-high heels. On the other, the creeping simplicity of plain leather with modest risers. The crowd thickens as a young man, newly arrived from England, proudly displays his practical yet refined footwear. His heels are barely an inch, but his coat sparkles with embroidery. He's met with polite nods and some raised eyebrows. Progress is slow. You consider the impact of politics here, too. The French court's obsession with grandeur clashes with the rising middle class's preference for utility. Shoes, it turns out, are not just fashion, but a social battleground. Soft joke, break. You half expect someone to invent convertible heels, adjustable height for day and night. Spoiler, that idea doesn't appear until centuries later, but imagine the sales pitch. By now, the shape of men's fashion is shifting under your feet, quite literally. Heels will continue to shrink, their symbolism changing with every step. You notice that, while men debate heel height, women's footwear simultaneously evolves in its own intricate dance, a reminder that fashion's story is always a duet. As evening falls, you think back to the last great party you attended, full of towering heels and whispered rivalries, and realize something profound. The heel is not just about height or beauty, but about power, identity, and the complex relationship between the two. Soon, the grand, high-heeled man of the Baroque will give way to a new kind of gentleman, who walks more firmly on the ground, but whose ambitions still reach skyward. But Until then, the heel remains a symbol of that delicate balancing act between old and new, between artifice and reality. You take a deep breath, the night air cool on your skin, and prepare to step into the next chapter of this storier world, where the heel's reign begins to wane, but its legacy refuses to be forgotten. The sun has set, and you find yourself in a smoky London tavern, surrounded by the hum of voices debating everything from politics to poetry. Here, beneath the flickering candlelight, the conversation turns once again to the ever-controversial high heel. You watch a group of gentlemen gathered near the hearth, each nursing a tankard of ale and sporting shoes that reflect a clear shift in taste. Heels are shorter, sturdier, and less flamboyant than the towering red ones you saw back in Versailles, but the stories, oh, those remain tall as ever. Mainstream historical fact: by the mid-1700s, men's heels had largely shortened across Europe, becoming more practical and less ostentatious, influenced by both shifting social norms and the rise of military fashion. One of the men, a dashing officer with a well-worn tricorn hat, leans forward to recount a tale of the battlefield. He claims that sturdy boots and low heels saved his life more than once, unlike the aristocrats who risked toppling during parades or ceremonies. You can't help but imagine the clumsy, high-heeled nobleman slipping on muddy ground while cannonballs roar nearby. Fringed tidbit: there's an old rumor, probably exaggerated, that a certain French general was mocked by his own troops for wearing heels so high that he couldn't mount his horse without assistance. Whether true or not, the story spread quickly, cementing heels as a less than heroic accessory in this smoky room. The debate flares: are heels a mark of refined status or an impractical affectation? One scholar might argue that heels served as early military footwear, helping cavalrymen secure their feet in stirrups, while others dismiss that as a myth, a way to justify fashion rather than necessity. You sip your drink, enjoying the mixture of facts and folklore that swirl around the subject. Suddenly, you're reminded of the last time you saw a foppish gentleman attempt to strut across a slick tavern floor, only to collide spectacularly with a serving wench carrying a tray. The room erupted in laughter, a moment of humility for high society's elevated footwear. You also notice the shift in materials. Leather is becoming king, replacing the lavish silk and brocade of earlier heels. The preference moves towards durability, signaling a growing respect for functionality over flamboyance. And yet, you find a curious contradiction. Some gentlemen continue to cling to their slightly raised heels as a final nod to their aristocratic roots, even as the rest of the world embraces practicality. A quick joke pops into your mind. Maybe the true height of a man's ego is measured in his heel inches, not his stature. The tavern's chatter turns political as well. With revolutions stirring across the continent, fashion becomes a subtle battleground of loyalty and ideology. Wearing high heels might mark you as a courtier, a monarchist. Choosing flats could signal enlightenment or rebellion. You imagine a revolutionary sneaking past guards, heels tucked away, ready to dismantle aristocratic power one step at a time, literally. And in the midst of it all, the women watch with amused eyes, perhaps shaking their heads at the lengths men will go to for status and style. Soft joke break. Somewhere, a cobbler must be rolling his eyes and muttering, "Just wait till these lads invent sneakers." As the night deepens, you realize that men's heels have evolved beyond mere footwear. They are a symbol of societal change, power struggles, and the endless human quest to balance appearance with purpose. You rise from your seat, the taverns, warmth fading behind you as you step into the cool night, ready to follow the heels, journey toward its inevitable decline and surprising resurgence centuries later. You wake to the soft light of dawn filtering through tall windows in a grand English manner. The year is now creeping toward the late 18th century, and the world of men's fashion is undergoing a quiet but irreversible shift. You slip your feet into a pair of shoes modest, with barely a heel to speak of. Walking feels different, more grounded. You wonder if anyone will miss those towering heels that once proclaimed power from every step. Mainstream, historical fact. By the late 1700s, men's heels had shrunk considerably across Europe, with the rise of Enlightenment ideals and practical needs driving a shift toward simpler, flatter footwear. But underneath the simplicity, something intriguing simmers. High heels aren't quite dead yet, they've evolved in meaning, serving less as flamboyant status symbols and more as subtle markers of identity and style. You overhear the footmen gossiping about how some older nobles still cling to their heels as relics of a more glorious past. Fringe tidbit: in England, a peculiar trend arises where men's shoes feature secret compartments, small cavities inside. The heels where gentlemen stash tiny notes or love letters. It's a romantic touch, almost spy-like, showing that even as heels shrink, their symbolism grows more complex. As you wander through the manor's hallways, polished wood floors creaking softly underfoot, you notice how the heel's function and form are debated among the upper classes. Some see it as an archaic affectation, a remnant of frivolity that must be shed for modern sensibility. Others view it as a vital thread connecting them to tradition and class. Historians still argue whether the decline of men's heels was driven primarily by shifting social ideals or by practical needs such as increased travel and military campaigns. You suspect it's a messy mix of both, with economics, politics, and fashion all tugging at the threads. In the drawing room, a gentleman demonstrates his perfectly balanced, low-heeled shoes to a small audience, emphasizing comfort and elegance without excess. His audience applauds politely, but you catch a wistful glance toward a portrait of a long-heeled ancestor whose shoes practically had their own zip code. A soft chuckle escapes you as you recall an old joke from a traveling bardhouseman once. Competed not just in duels but in heel height, risking sprains and spills just to outshine their rivals. "Who needs swords," he said, "when you can trip your enemy into submission?" Outside, the garden is alive with fresh blooms and the chatter of servants. You watch as a young nobleman practices walking on the grass, his shoes, small heels, sinking slightly into the soft earth. A reminder that the mighty heel cannot conquer everything. You also consider the gendered implications. While men's heels fall out of favor, women's continue to grow in height and extravagance. The asymmetry in footwear seems to mirror wider societal divisions and expectations. Another quirky detail: some men experimented with detachable heels, allowing them to switch between the fashionable height for court and practical flats for travel. These early convertible heels were unstable and unpopular, but the idea was ahead of its time. You sit for a moment in the Manners Library, surrounded by dusty tomes debating style, class, and identity. The heel's story here is one of transition, a fading echo of extravagance giving way to the practical rhythms of the modern age. And yet, like a ghost at the feast, the heel's past grandeur still haunts every polished shoe, reminding you that fashion is never just about clothes. It's about power, culture, and the stories we choose to tell with every step. You step out onto the cobbled streets of late 18th century Europe. The world changing faster than ever beneath your feet. The age of revolutions has shaken monarchies and social orders alike. The heels that once proudly proclaimed aristocratic power have become an increasingly rare sight on men. Instead, you see a rise in boots and practical shoe symbols of a world where action and merit start to matter more than mere appearances. Mainstream historical fact: the French Revolution of 1789 and other uprisings across Europe dramatically reshaped social hierarchies, making the extravagant dress of the Ancien regime, including men's high heels, socially and politically risky. You observe a group of young revolutionaries dressed in simple flat-soled, shoes worn, but they plan speeches and rallies. To them, heels represent everything they're fighting against: excess, privilege, and oppression. Fashion becomes a political statement as much as personal style. Fringe tidbit: legend has it that during the height of the revolution, some aristocrats hid tiny heel pieces in their boots as secret tokens to identify themselves to allies in the chaos. A discreet heel code of sorts. Historians still debate whether this practice really existed or is just a romantic myth spun later by storytellers. The streets echo with footsteps, some steady, some hesitant as men adjust to new roles in a society where power is no longer guaranteed by birth or shoe height. You notice how the heel's symbolic weight shifts. It becomes less about status and more about survival and solidarity. You wander into a modest cafe, where a lively discussion is underway. An older gentleman argues that abandoning heels means abandoning culture, tradition, and the very essence of what it means to be a gentleman. Meanwhile, a younger voice counters that true dignity comes from action, integrity, and equality, not from propping oneself up on an artificial platform. Soft joke break. You imagine if those revolutionaries had to run away from angry mobs in high heels, let's just say, history might have looked very different. The footwear industry, like society itself, adapts to the winds of change. Cobblers experiment with more practical designs, durable leather, low heels, easy soles catering to a populace increasingly on the move. Travel and military service demand comfort and functionality over flamboyance. Yet, the heel's legacy lingers in unexpected ways. You hear whispers of fashion circles where old-school aristocrats gather in secret salons, daring to wear their heels one last time as an act of nostalgic rebellion. These gatherings are small, secretive, and spoken of in hushed tones, a reminder that even as fashions fall, memories endure. Another quirky detail: some men during this era carried tiny heel samples or shoe fragments as keepsakes or symbols of their heritage, almost like miniature family crests. These curiosities have puzzled historians, who wonder whether they were expressions of pride, sorrow, or resistance. You step into a bookstore and skim through fashion manuals and etiquette guides published in this revolutionary time. There's a clear shift toward advising men to adopt simpler, cleaner lines in dress, favoring practicality and understated elegance over the ostentatious and the ornate. Historians still argue whether the decline of men's heels was an inevitable social evolution or a direct consequence of political upheaval and changing power dynamics. The answer, as often, lies somewhere in the messy middle. As you leave the bookstore, the evening sky is streaked with clouds, and the distant sound of church bells marks the passing hours. You reflect on how the heel's journey mirrors the tumultuous path of history, itself rising to symbolize power and privilege, then shrinking under the weight of reason, revolution, and reality. And yet, even in decline, the heel refuses to disappear entirely. Its spirit lives on in cultural memory, in the subtle swagger of certain fashion choices, and in the quiet defiance of those who dare to stand just a little taller. You take a final look at your own shoes, solid, practical, unassuming, and feel a strange connection to the generations before who wrestled with the same balance between appearance and authenticity, between status and substance. As night deepens, you prepare to move forward with the story, tracing how the heel's influence would fade from men's fashion for centuries, only to return unexpectedly in new forms and meanings. The calendar turns to the 19th century, and you find yourself strolling through a rapidly industrializing cityscape. Factories puff out smoke, horse-drawn carriages rattle along cobblestone streets, and the air is thick with a mix of ambition and soot. Men's footwear reflects this changing world. Heels, once high and dramatic, are now virtually non-existent on men's shoes. Instead, you see practical boots and sturdy walking shoes dominating the scene by mainstream historical fact. By the 1800s, men's fashion had fully embraced flat or very low-heeled shoes, as the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the middle class favored functionality and comfort over aristocratic excess. You pause outside a workshop where a cobbler bends over his bench, crafting a pair of boots designed to withstand the rigors of factory work and long walks across the city. The craftsmanship is impressive, but the shoes bear no trace of flamboyant heels, just solid soles built for purpose. Fringe tidbit: some eccentric gentleman in London reportedly experimented with hidden heel inserts that could be swapped out for social occasions, but these remained a niche curiosity and never gained mainstream popularity. Historians still debate whether these convertible heels were genuine fashion attempts or simply novelty items. As you walk further, you overhear snippets of conversation from a nearby club where gentlemen discuss the dwindling significance of footwear as a status symbol. One older man laments what happened to the days when a man's heel declared his rank at court. Another counters, perhaps true status should be earned, not worn. You chuckle quietly, thinking about the heel wars of centuries past, the competition for height and color that sometimes seemed more dangerous than any duel. Imagine if they'd invented heel insurance, you muse. The role of heels in gender norms becomes more pronounced. With men's heels nearly extinct, women's heels grow taller and more elaborate, reinforcing societal ideas about masculinity and femininity through footwear. You reflect on how something as simple as heel height can carry complex cultural messages about power, identity, and attraction. You notice, too, that the concept of height itself starts to shift in importance. No longer propped up by heels, men focus on posture, bearing, and presence to command respect, qualities that can't be bought in a cobbler's shop. A curious fact surfaces during this time. Some military uniforms included slightly raised heels for cavalrymen, primarily to help keep feet steady in stirrups. However, these heels were minimal and purely functional, nothing like the flamboyant red heels of Louis XIV's court. Historians still debate whether men's heels in earlier centuries were genuinely practical for horse riding or mostly symbolic. The truth likely lies somewhere between a useful adaptation and a fashion statement. As dusk falls, you find yourself inside a smoky gentleman's club. The scent of pipe tobacco and polished wood surrounds you. Here, men drink and discuss politics, business, and cultural, while sporting the new standard, modest, flat footwear. The mood is serious, but you catch glimpses of nostalgia for bygone fashions. A witty remark floats through the room. Why wear heels to stand tall, when a sharp mind will always outshine any shoe? You smile, acknowledging that the heel's story is not just about shoes, but about how societies redefine power and identity over time. Before you leave, you glimpse a small collection of antique shoes displayed behind glass bright red heels, with delicate buckles, relics of an era when men's footwear was a spectacle of status. You consider how fashion cycles through extremes, how the lavish excess of one century can give way to sober practicality in the next, only to be reinvented later. Walking back into the night, you feel the steady rhythm of your own footsteps on the pavement, grounded, confident, and free from the precarious balance of towering heels. The story of men's heels may have dimmed for now, but you know it's not finished. Fashion, after all, loves a comeback. You find yourself transported to the early 20th century, a time of rapid social upheaval and extraordinary change. The world is electrified, not just by technology, but by new ideas about class, gender, and identity. Men's footwear remains largely practical and flat, but whispers of rebellion and reinvention are beginning to stir in fashion circles. High heels for men have all but vanished from daily life, but their story is about to take an unexpected turn. Mainstream historical fact: throughout the early 1900s, men's fashion largely favored low-heeled shoes, with styles like Oxfords and brogues dominating, reflecting the growing middle class and the industrialized world's need for practicality. You stroll into a bustling jazz club, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the pulse of swinging rhythms. Here, some daring men experiment with flashy accessories and daring styles, challenging the rigid norms of the time. Among them, a few bold souls revive high-heeled shoes not for status or practicality, but as a statement of individuality and style. Fringe tidbit: the Peacock Revolution fashion movement of the 1960s is often credited with reintroducing flamboyant men's footwear, including platform shoes and heels. But in fact, underground scenes as early as the 1920s had men experimenting with heels as expressions of identity, though these were far from mainstream. Historians still argue about the extent and cultural impact of these early experiments. You overhear a conversation between two young men debating the meaning of such fashion choices. One argues heels are a bold challenge to societal norms. The other worries about the risk of ridicule. You think about the courage it takes to wear something that stands out so vividly in a crowd. Light joke bubbles up. Maybe they just wanted to reach the top shelf without asking. You notice how heels for men begin to split from their old associations with aristocracy and enter new realms: performance, rebellion, art. The heel becomes less about status and more about self-expression. Meanwhile, the world outside is changing. Rapidly: wars, women's suffrage, economic shifts. The rise of women into public and professional spheres subtly reshapes ideas about masculinity and appearance. Footwear starts to become a playground for those willing to blur gender lines. You pause to consider how heels that once enforced strict gender and class distinctions are now tools to question and redefine them. In the fashion boutiques of Paris and London, experimental designers toy with exaggerated shapes and heights in men's shoes, aiming to shock and inspire. Some creations are outrageous, a cross between theatrical costume and everyday wear. They provoke both admiration and scorn. Historians still debate whether these avant-garde designs were genuine fashion trends or more of an artistic commentary. You suspect they were a bit of both. You smile, recalling a story of a famous jazz musician who famously wore bright red heels during performances, not just to dazzle, but to command presence on stage. The heels became part of his persona, blending music and style into a singular art form. Walking down the street, you spot a man confidently, striding in platform boots with modest heels, unbothered by whispers or stares. His shoes proclaim, style has returned with a new purpose, not to intimidate or declare rank, but to celebrate individuality. The heel's journey has come full circle, from symbol of power to forgotten relic to bold statement of self. You feel the steady rhythm of your own shoes on the pavement and marvel at how something as simple as heel height can carry centuries of cultural meaning, evolving with each step society takes. As night deepens and the city lights twinkle, you realize the story of men's heels is far from over. Fashion, like history itself, loves a comeback, and sometimes the smallest changes make the biggest statements. You drift into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a time of dizzying shifts in culture, technology, and fashion. The world feels smaller and more connected, yet also more fragmented and diverse. Men's footwear choices have multiplied. Beyond imagination, and the high heel is no longer the exclusive domain of aristocrats or theatrical performers. Instead, it reappears in surprising ways, loaded with new meanings and challenges. Mainstream historical fact. Starting in the 1970s, the glam rock and disco movements reignited interest in men's heels, with musicians like David Bowie and Prince popularizing platform shoes and high heels as bold expressions of identity and performance. You find yourself at a vibrant concert where the stage lights splash color over flamboyantly dressed men, their shoes towering in defiance of convention. Here, heels symbolize freedom, gender fluidity, and rebellion against rigid societal norms. Fringe tidbit. Some fashion historians argue that the modern resurgence of men's heels owes as much to subcultures like punk, goth, and drag communities as to mainstream fashion runways. Yet others contend that this revival reflects a deeper historical cycle of power symbols returning in new guises. Scholars still debate the cultural roots and implications of this trend. You notice how heels on men now traverse multiple meanings, simultaneously style, empowerment, theatricality, and even protest. Wearing heels becomes an act of self-definition, a way to question or embrace identity. Walking through a bustling city, you see men in all kinds of shoes, sleek loafers, chunky sneakers, towering platforms, even stiletto heels. The diversity reflects a world less interested in rigid categories and more open to personal choice. A little joke crosses your mind. If a man wearing heels falls in the city and no one's around, does he make a sound? Yes, a fabulous one. The heel's symbolism has evolved from marking nobility to expressing individuality and sometimes pure theatrical fun. It dances on the boundaries of gender and style, challenging old assumptions. You think about how the heel once helped kings literally stand above their subjects, and now helps performers stand out on stage, inspiring audiences. The transformation is remarkable, and yet the heel's power to captivate remains unchanged. You wander into a boutique showcasing avant-garde men's footwear. The designs are wild, some futuristic, others vintage-inspired, The shop owner tells stories of clients who buy heels not to impress others, but to feel taller, stronger, or simply more themselves. Historians still debate whether men's heels today represent a genuine shift in masculinity or simply a niche fashion statement embraced by subcultures and celebrities. The conversation is ongoing, and the future remains open as the night winds down. You reflect on the long, winding journey of the men's heel, from practical horse-riding necessity to royal status symbol, to near extinction, and finally to a bold, multifaceted emblem of identity. You feel a sense of calm understanding. The heel is more than just a shoe. It's a mirror reflecting changing ideas about power, gender, and self-expression. Your own shoes tap softly on the pavement, steady and unassuming. Yet you appreciate the stories they carry, the echoes of centuries past, the footsteps of those who dared to stand tall, literally and figuratively. You take a deep breath, ready to let the story rest now. The heel's tale is woven into the fabric of history, and like all good stories, it evolves with each telling. Word count 1010 Windbano. As your eyelids grow heavy and the world quiets around you, imagine the gentle sway of histories, footsteps fading into a soft hum. The heel, once a towering symbol of power and status, has slipped into the gentle cadence of time, leaving behind whispers of stories and echoes of change. Breathe deeply. Let the intricate dance of fashion and identity drift slowly from your mind, like the last flicker of a candle flame. Know that every step you take carries a bit of that history, an invisible thread connecting past and present. Crown and cobbler, rebel and royal dot, feel the calm settle in as the night wraps around you, soft and reassuring. Tomorrow will bring new stories, new journeys, but for now, rest in the quiet comfort of knowing that even the smallest details, like the heel of a shoe, hold worlds within them. Good night and sweet dreams.